and the grunge is spreading. This is the spring look for 1993.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we are here to talk about what I would consider the single most important decade in the entire history of alternative music, the 90s.
I think about the 90s.
But first, let's talk about the 80s. Ah, yes, the 80s. The decade of big hair, Miami Vice, power suits, sax solos, and of course, epic montages of people training around the clock to make their dreams come true. The 80s were very arguably the corniest decade in mainstream pop culture, but at the same time, the alternative music scene was quickly growing. There were college rock bands like the B-52s and REM, goth and post-punk like Sisters of Mercy and the Smiths, and whatever genre you want to call bands like Sonic Youth, Red Hot Chili Peppers, the Pixies, and all the other bands breaking new ground in the 80s. But the 90s are when it all really came together, and for better or worse, the underground became the mainstream. Nirvana opened the door for everybody, leading the way for all the bands that basically created the foundation for almost all of the alternative music of today. The Beastie Boys and alternative rap, Korn and nu metal, 9 Inch Nails and industrial, Oasis and Britpop, as well as some other stuff that, let's just say, did not age quite so well, such as the short-lived swing revival. So we are going to talk about all of that and more, and there is a lot to get into here. So this is going to be a long one, but I will do my very best to break it all down. So grab some popcorn and get comfortable. Also, I want to give a shout out to Mike the Snare, who gave me permission to borrow his video format for this one from his video about mainstream music that defined the 90s. He makes absolutely incredible videos, so make sure you check his channel out. And really quick, before we go any further, have you checked out my Patreon? Patrons get early access to all my main channel videos and my podcasts. I also do giveaways sometimes. For example, I just gave away a pair of these Eargasm earplugs. And if you want me to review your music, there's a way to do that as well. All you gotta do is join at the $10 and up level. Then every month I do a call for submissions. If you want me to review something, all you gotta do is drop it in the comments of that post. Then I will review it live on Twitch and post it on Patreon for everyone to see. So if that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video, and I appreciate your support. So with that out of the way, the first selection from 1990 is Been Caught Stealing by Jane's Addiction. And I'm picking this one for a few reasons. First of all, because if I had to pick one band that was really responsible for putting alternative music on the map, aside from grunge, it would be Jane's Addiction. They combined punk, metal, funk, and a lot of just really eclectic influences from genres like klezmer and prog rock in a way that felt like a real evolution of the college rock thing that 80s bands like REM were doing. To me, it feels like the first example of like truly 90s alternative music. Something that just couldn't have come out in, say, 1985. It was very innovative and original, but they still had these super catchy, accessible songs that got them a lot of mainstream recognition. For example, this video won Best Alternative Music Video at that year's MTV Video Awards. But maybe even more importantly than the band itself, Jane's Addiction frontman Perry Farrell also started Lollapalooza, which, as far as I'm aware, was the very first traveling alternative music festival. The first lineup, which I went to back in 1991, was Jane's Addiction, Rollins Band, 9 Inch Nails, Susie and the Banshees, Fishbone, Ice-T, Violent Femmes, just a who's who of alternative music in 1991, and honestly, a lineup that would still be pretty great if they did this tour today.
It features Jane's Addiction, along with such opening acts as Living Colour, Ice-T, Susie and the Banshees, and the Butthole Surfers.
Lollapalooza was a very big deal, taking alternative music on the road and playing to over 500,000 people that year, and because of its success, Lollapalooza itself was the template for really pretty much every other traveling festival since then. For example, Lilith Fair, Ozfest, Mayhem, and of course, Warped Tour. But when it comes to Jane's Addiction, obviously the single most important thing they gave to us was launching the career of Dave Navarro, which means that Jane's Addiction indirectly gave us Ink Master, the gift that keeps on giving.
I want to watch your technique. You're going in that way?
Which brings us to 1991. And this is an incredibly difficult year to tackle because there is just so much to choose from. This is the year when bands like Red Hot Chili Peppers, Smashing Pumpkins, Primus, Pearl Jam, My Bloody Valentine, and tons of other iconic bands had their breakthrough successes, which was amazing enough. But it's also the year that the Lord chose to bless us with Super Mario World, which to this day is a 10 out of 10 in my book.
Introducing the next generation from Nintendo, New Super Mario World, created especially for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System.
But with all of that being said, if we're talking about 1991 in the context of alternative music, the choice is obvious. It Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana. And I don't really have much to add here to what I've said before about Nirvana or everything that's been written about them over the years, other than to say this: Nirvana really truly did change the world pretty much overnight.
Grunge is the fashion trend launched by the hard-driving guitar music known as the Seattle Sound. The grunge look is an urban lumberjack, anything-goes ensemble of duck boots, tattered shirts, and long underwear.
So I'm going to move on here because there's other things that I want to focus on that haven't been talked about so much. But to make a long story short, Nirvana's impact simply cannot be overstated, and to this day, we're still living in their shadow. Which brings us to 1992, and my choice for this year is So What You Want by the Beastie Boys off of their album Check Your Head. And for those of you who may not be familiar with their career, they started out as a hardcore punk band back in 1980 before switching to rap. And then with this album, they kind of brought some of those punk influences back and kind of brought it all together and essentially created the genre of alternative rap, which may not seem super groundbreaking these days when it's far from unusual for a rapper to be into punk and have colored hair and stuff. But back in 1992, the idea of combining punk, rap, skateboarding, and the emerging idea of streetwear into one thing was just totally unheard of, completely out of left field. I did a whole video about the Beastie Boys if you want to know more, but I mean, even just look at the video for this song. You could put this video out today, unedited, and it would seem 100% current. That is how ahead of the curve these guys were. The Beastie Boys walked so that Lil Peep, Playboi Carti, Supreme, and Turnstile could run. Full stop. I think in hindsight, Ill Communication from 1994 might be their best album, but to me, this one is the one that really stands out as the one where they really put their creative thumbprint on the scene, and it's really just like the perfect snapshot of what alternative culture was in 1992. And moving on to 1993, we have Thunder Kiss 65 by White Zombie. And I chose this one because it shows the changing nature of the media landscape, in particular MTV. MTV started in 1981, and by the mid-80s, it had evolved into the most important hitmaker, tastemaker destination for music, and really for like youth culture in general. If your video got into MTV's rotation, you were on the fast track to becoming a star. For example, a lot of the biggest names that we think of from the 80s, like Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Van Halen, all got heavy airplay from MTV in the 80s, and a big part of what turned them into truly iconic household names was being played literally 10 or 20 times a day on MTV for tens of millions of people all over the country, in a time where we didn't have TikTok and Spotify and all the other ways to discover music. But by the 90s, MTV's formula had evolved. Instead of just playing music videos around the clock like a radio station would, they started making a lot of original content like their animation show Liquid Television, and maybe most notably, the very first reality TV show, The Real World. And one of the most successful original shows that they created was Beavis and Butthead. If you're watching this, I'm guessing you're familiar, but just in case you aren't, essentially the show was these two stoner kids from the middle of nowhere who would go around town doing random dumb shit like working a shift at a fast food restaurant, and then in between that, they would sit down and make fun of music videos. The show became insanely popular within the first year, and kind of surprisingly became one of the most important platforms for breaking new artists, especially in the world of rock and metal. And White Zombie was probably the single biggest example of the show's power.
The key moment was Beavis and Butthead.
And aside from that, White Zombie themselves were just extremely 90s. Dreadlocks, weird hats, the goggles, stripy shirts. The only way this video could get more 90s would be a guest appearance by Sonic the Hedgehog. Which brings us to 1994. Another year that's so full of important moments that it's really hard to choose just one. There's Korn's debut album, Bush and the birth of post-grunge, Green Day's Dookie hitting #2 on Billboard, and making them the first real punk band from the underground DIY scene to see that kind of success. And so it's really hard to pick just one piece of music for this year. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and go with the entire event that was Woodstock 94.
Here come those darn hippies again.
The original Woodstock Festival in 1969 was billed as 3 days of peace, love, and music, held at a decommissioned airbase in upstate New York, and it was viewed by a lot of people as really the defining moment of the hippie generation, with a lineup of absolutely legendary artists like Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and The Who, among dozens of others. Woodstock 94 celebrated the 25th anniversary of the original festival, and in the same way as Woodstock 69 was sort of the defining moment of that era, I would say that Woodstock 94 was probably the defining moment of the 90s alternative scene. The Woodstock 94 featured a lot of legacy artists and safer acts like Joe Cocker, Melissa Etheridge, and Blues Traveler, but the real highlights were the next generation of 90s bands that they booked, including Primus, Rollins Band, and Red Hot Chili Peppers. All the Woodstock festivals after the original one seemed to be kind of doomed to disaster. Maybe Janis Joplin put a curse on them or something, I don't know. And this one was no exception. It rained really hard that weekend and turned pretty much the entire venue into just a giant mud pit.
Did you get dragged in the mud?
No, I walked in.
You did this intentionally?
Yeah, I followed mud people in here.
But unlike the chill hippies of Woodstock 69, this was the 90s, so things got edgy, with the crowd throwing giant globs of mud at the bands on stage, which was kind of funny at first, but you could tell that it quickly got very, very irritating for the bands. The whole thing was shown on pay-per-view to hundreds of thousands of people, with clips shown on MTV and even like the mainstream TV news. So the whole nation, and probably a lot of the world, was able to see this in a way that they never saw the original Woodstock. And the two moments that really stick out to me are, first of all, 9 Inch Nails, who played a live version of Closer that was just absolutely perfect, and really cemented them as one of the bands to pay attention to in this generation. And most notably, Green Day's set, which turned into basically a giant mud fight with the audience.
These idiots, just like you guys. Okay, we're gone. Goodbye.
And eventually, Green Day's bassist Mike Dirnt was tackled by a security guard by mistake, which knocked out one of his front teeth. That mud fight ended up being a big highlight of the media coverage around Woodstock, and with millions and millions of eyeballs on this thing, that moment is what really put them on the map, with Dookie hitting #2 on Billboard later that year, and turning Green Day into, well, Green Day. Which brings us to 1995. And my first thought for this year was to mention Oasis and the brief Britpop trend.
Anyway, here's Wonderwall.
But I thought about it a bit more, and as much as Britpop is quintessentially 90s, there's something that represents the pure, undistilled essence of the 90s even more, and that is the movie Clueless.
I don't know why Dion's going out with a high school boy. They're like dogs. You have to clean them and feed them, and they're just like these nervous creatures that jump and slobber all over you.
I remember seeing it when I was a junior in high school, mostly just because I liked Alicia Silverstone. I mean, who didn't? And at the time, nobody really thought that it would be anything other than just another disposable teen movie. But since then, it's become legendary, with a whole new wave of people discovering it after Iggy Azalea referenced it in the video for Fancy in 2014. It unexpectedly became a hit, and aside from launching the career of Brittany Murphy, rest in peace, it also broke a little band called the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones when it featured their song Where'd You Go in the movie's big dance scene, which was a big deal because, as you know, the prom dance scene is the climax of every teen movie. It also helped jumpstart No Doubt's career by using their song Just a Girl in one of the scenes in the background and including it on the soundtrack a year before they blew up. And so between those two songs, I think this movie and its soundtrack played a pivotal role in jumpstarting the third wave ska punk trend, and it just does not get more 90s than Save Ferris and Real Big Fish. Which brings us to 1996, solidly into the mid-90s, and the year that I graduated high school. And my pick for this year is The Beautiful People by Marilyn Manson from his album Antichrist Superstar. He first got onto the map with his cover of Sweet Dreams by the Eurythmics, but this song proved that he could do more than just a twisted 90s cover of an 80s song. And my personal opinion about Manson is that he seems like kind of a creep, but putting aside the many allegations against him, on a purely artistic level, you really have to give Manson credit for basically creating the template for the entire branch of industrial metal that has followed after him, both sonically and aesthetically. For example, not to take anything away from either one of them because I think both of them are great, but if you look at Motionless in White and what Ghostman is doing these days, both of them are essentially an updated version of Antichrist Superstar. And he also kicked off a whole new wave of the Satanic Panic. The first wave of the Satanic Panic was back in the 80s when Christian fundamentalists blamed Iron Maiden and Judas Priest for teenagers unaliving themselves and playing D&D.
Since kicking off his Dead to the World tour in October of '96, Manson has met opposition at almost every stop along the way.
If they're going to have an atmosphere here that praises Satan, we're going to lift Jesus higher.
And I would have thought that by 1996, after movies like Natural Born Killers and games like Mortal Kombat, where you pressed buttons to rip someone's spine out, I would have thought at that point we would have all gotten kind of numb to this kind of like edgy shock imagery. But Marilyn Manson was just so damn good at it that the fundamentalists took his bait and helped turn him into exactly what he claimed to be, which was the Antichrist Superstar. Because think about it, if you're a teenager, what could possibly make you want to listen to an album more than your parents telling you that you are not allowed to? Which brings us to 1997, which I consider to be kind of a pivotal year in alternative music, even though you don't hear people talk about it very often. And what I mean is that up until this point, when you said alternative music, it really implied a rock band, meaning bass, drums, guitars, and a front person / singer. But as the underground electronic music scene started to flourish in the late 80s and early 90s, that definition made less and less sense. Especially in the UK, where the rave scene and then a few years later the jungle and drum and bass scene were attracting a lot of the creative energy and young fans who would have been into alternative rock a few years earlier.
We're telling you about gigantic outdoor raves happening across the region almost every weekend. Sometimes they ended in confrontations with the police after residents complained of deafening music in the small hours of the morning.
Which brings me to my choice for 1997, Firestarter by The Prodigy.
On the beach you hated, filthy infatuated.
This song was America's introduction to the genre known as big beat, which was built on, well, big, aggressive breakbeats that had the energy of rock. It was a subgenre of electronic music, but it didn't feel like nerdy techno or house music that would be played at some club for normies that wanted to party. And out of all that, The Prodigy really stood out, largely because their frontman Keith Flint, who had this really unique look and was just an insanely charismatic guy, who sadly passed away in 2019. Rest in peace to Keith. And aside from them, I really think of 1997 as the year that alternative and electronic music really came together. As a few other examples, Filter and Crystal Method did a song, Korn did a song with Dust Brothers, the band Garbage mixed alternative rock with some electronic elements. And although big beat as a subgenre was pretty short-lived and it pretty much died out by the early 2000s, that marriage of rock and electronic music has only grown stronger since then, with artists now like Sullivan, King, and Keizo who are basically equal parts of both. And with that, we are getting close to the end of the 90s in the year of our Lord, 1998. And if you recall, at the beginning of the video, I said that the pieces of music that I chose weren't necessarily the best on a purely musical basis. Well, this would be a great example. Zoot Suit Riot by Cherry Poppin' Daddies. First of all, this band has one of the absolute worst names of all time, and the song is, well, awful. But I'm choosing it because it kicked off the short-lived swing revival fad, where for about a year and a half, people in their 20s were dancing like it was 1944 and taking swing dance lessons. It's true, the 90s were basically one big fever dream. It probably peaked the following year when Brian Setzer Orchestra's cover of Jump, Jive and Wail blew up, and even The Gap got in on the swing revival action. And there's not a lot to say about the swing revival itself because, like I said, it came and went in maybe a little bit more than a year. But I'm bringing it up because it was such a great example of how the 90s were really just this wild, lawless time for music. Like, to give you an example of how insane the 90s were, this is the decade where Primus, of all bands, had not one, but 2 albums in the Billboard Top 10. It really felt like the last time that just about anything could get popular, no matter how weird it was. I think this YouTube comment sums it up perfectly. As you tell your kids and grandkids, yes, there was a time that hip-hop, grunge, and swing music coexisted in pop music. We're not sure what the hell was going on. Which brings us to 1999, the end of the decade, and a song that really kind of marked the end of the era of weird is cool, All the Small Things by Blink-182.
All the small things, true care, truth brings.
And to be clear, I absolutely love Blink, and this is one of my favorite albums of all time to this day. But my point here is that the entire reason that Blink became popular is because they really leaned into the pop part of pop punk. As I've said before, they were basically a punk boy band, and this video was full of references to mainstream pop artists like Christina Aguilera, Backstreet Boys, 98 Degrees, and NSYNC. And so they were really like the polar opposite of Nirvana and Green Day, or some of the other weird artists that got big in the 90s, like Presidents of the United States of America, in that those other bands did end up becoming big mainstream successes, but very unexpectedly. These were basically grimy DIY bands that on paper really shouldn't have ever gotten any kind of commercial success. And when they did get that success, they made no compromises, and the mainstream actually changed to embrace their values rather than the other way around. And Blink was an authentic punk band, but they blew up specifically because they were non-threatening and palatable to that audience of mainstream suburban teenagers who watched TRL and were looking for something a little bit more edgy than NSYNC, but not as edgy or dark as Alice in Chains. And then, of course, there was Woodstock 99, which that's a whole other conversation. But that really kind of put the nail in the coffin of the 90s love affair with weirdness. And so that brings us to the 2000s, where, in my opinion, alternative culture was really defined by the same dynamic that created Blink-182. It's where we saw the rise of mall emo, hipster indie rock, whatever you want to call Metro Station, and all those other permutations of underground alternative culture that it had all the edges sanded off to make it more palatable. And if you want to hear more about that, check out my other video about alternative music that defined the 2000s. There's a link to that video in the description, as well as a link to Mike the Snare. Make sure you check out his channel as well. And also, I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. It is because of your support that I am able to do this full time. If you join, you'll get access to all my videos and podcasts a week early. I also do giveaways. There are members only channels in my Discord that I'm super active in, and there's a way to have me review your music. So if any of that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.